having trouble settling this morning, so we'll have to deal with that. We on?
Yep, you're good to go.
Oh, I lost my co-chair script.
Ugh.
I am gonna pretend to co-chair for today. Let me just find the script that Nicole made us. Nicole, I had it here 2 seconds ago. Do you have it handy by any chance?
I
Can
sure
you do
do.
us the intro and then I'll get better at pretending to co-chair?
I sure can. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nicole Bettinardi. I'm the OWEB Executive Assistant and Board Liaison. This is the meeting of the Acquisitions, Restoration, and Emerging Issues Committee. I would like to remind everyone that this is a virtual meeting. It is being live streamed on OWEB's YouTube channel and being recorded rather. If you are interested in any of the information, the agenda is on the board and committee section of the OWEB website. And then that is the intro, and I will pass it back to Sarah for introductions.
Thank you, Nicole. For the record, I'm Sarah O'Brien, Executive Director of OWEB, having trouble getting started on my first meeting this morning here. Friends, before we go introductions, I want to say this committee, that our other board committees are getting a little bit of a soft launch and kind of a getting to know you and like talking about charters and talking about co-chairs. We got a lot for you guys to do, both in this meeting and in the next couple of meetings. So we're going to dive right into business today. If we have time at the end, we'll revisit the question of how to put together probably what will be a shared committee charter and some of the content we're thinking about that, and ask for volunteers for co-chairs. If we don't have time, I'll quickly ask for volunteers for co-chairs and we'll vote at the beginning of the next meeting. But I promise this is the only meeting I'll facilitate, and then either somebody will volunteer to be co-chairs or they will be voluntold between meetings, and then we'll be good to go moving forward. You guys ready to cruise? Should we do introductions? I'm going to start with board members here. Russ, you're first on my screen, and then Bruce after
Sure.
Russ. Go ahead.
Russ Hoflick, member at large, split my time between Portland and Lincoln City.
Thanks, Russ. Bruce, and then Eric.
I'm Bruce Buckmaster, also a member at large from Astoria.
Took you a second, Bruce. Eric, and then Dan.
Yes, good morning. I'm Eric Murray, representing NOAA Fisheries.
And I am Dan Brown, ex officio board member, non-voting, representing the Environmental Protection Agency. Good morning, everybody.
For being here. Mark Webb, and then Kelly.
Hi, I'm Mark Webb, represent Environmental Quality Commission, live in Grant County.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kelly Coates. I'm the tribal co-chair for the OWEB board, and I am coming to you from Talent, Oregon today.
Thanks, members. Did I miss anybody, or should we go to staff here? Let's go to staff. Brian and then Renee on my screen.
Good morning, everybody. Brian Walcott, Water Acquisition and Capacity Grants Coordinator.
Good morning, everyone. Renee Davis, Acquisitions and Special Programs Manager at OWEB. Good to see all of you.
Eric and then Miriam.
Good morning, everyone. Eric Williams, Restoration Grants Manager at OWEB.
Hi, I'm Miriam Forney, Land Acquisitions Coordinator.
And Audrey.
Good morning, everyone. I'm the Drinking Water Source Protection Program Specialist. How many words are in my title?
That's why I like my title.
Yeah,
but I still screw
it's
it up.
easy. Drinking water. You'll hear from me today. I'm like Audrey Squires.
Thanks, Audrey. I want to comment before we go to members of the public that the OWEB team now among 8 staff has 2 Erics, 2 Miriams, 2 Audreys, and 2 Nicoles. So, you know, we're big on the twins, but we only have one of each of those here today. So that helps a little bit. Nicole, should we go ahead and allow members of the public to do introductions, and then we can shift? I'll do a quick overview of the agenda, and then we'll shift into public comment. And we know who's here with us today, even if it's not time for official public stuff yet. Joe and then Mark.
Morning, everybody. Joe Buttafuoco with Coalition of Oregon Land Trust. Thanks so much for serving on this committee, everyone.
Thanks for being here, Joe. Mark, are you with us? You might be double muted, Mark. You look unmuted, but we can't hear you. I'm going to give you a second. Okay, I'll go to Cheryl and then we'll try Mark again at the end. Go ahead, Cheryl.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Cheryl Horton. I'm with Midcoast Watersheds Council, and I'm also the coordinator for the OCCEC Estuary FIP.
Thanks for being here. Lori, you're muted. You're really muted. I know what your situation is. I can tell.
And now I'm no longer. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Lori Wayburn with the Pacific Forest Trust.
Thanks for being here. Mark, can you get through now or not?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. Hi, my name is Mark McLaughlin. I'm Conservation Director for the North Coast Land Conservancy. We're in Seaside, Oregon.
Good to meet you, Mark. And I see Connie's iPhone. Nope, there they went. They're not there anymore. Okay, well, if we have any public comment, we can do any other introductions we need to when we get there. I'm going to quickly share my screen with the agenda here, and you'll see why I'm moving you through fairly quickly. Welcome and introductions we did. Public comment is up next, and Nicole will run us through that. I'm going to give a very brief kind of high-level overview of OWEB programs that fit under this committee. And sort of the committee's role in moving forward, which we talked about a fair bit also at the recent board meeting. At that point, I'll ask board members to flag, we'll have our work cut out for us with a couple of different programs for the next couple of meetings here. But if you see something in there as we're presenting that you definitely want like a 101 or a little more information on before we get to a funding decision or a program conversation, I'll ask you to flag it then, and we can kind of add that to our work plan for the year. We have 2 grant award funding recommendations in front of the board committee today. As Audrey said, drinking water source protection grant awards and water acquisitions. And then we're going to dive right into what I told this committee at our January board meeting would be our primary focus really for the year. We'll probably have some time for other work, but this is going to be an intense one with an upfront workload here. Talking through some of our plans for modernization and changes to the land acquisitions program. Renee will talk us through that, and we'll have a fair amount of time for board discussion, question and answer. And I'll ask you guys too to flag there kind of, thinking ahead, what would you like to learn more about before we get too deep in the discussion? Who would you like to hear from on these topics? And so this is the board's chance to kind of help us daylight sort of information, context, history, background needs that you'll want as we dive into these land acquisition modernization conversations. And then, as I mentioned, if time allows, we'll do a little discussion on co-chair and charter. And if not, we'll circle back to that. Audrey, did you have a question before we go to public comment or an addition?
Yeah, just a quick correction. You mentioned we're doing funding recommendations. We're not yet doing funding recommendations.
That's right.
Yeah.
Renee has told me that. Renee, probably half a dozen times in the last week, and it still comes out of my mouth. I'm sorry.
That's okay. We're
Thank
so
you.
close. It's happening. The TRT is happening Monday. It's very exciting.
That's a preview.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll have a preview of the Drinking Water Source Protection Program grant awards. I should have just read the agenda and kept myself out of trouble. Okay, gang. Nicole, do you want to steer us through public comment here?
Yes, ma'am. First of all, I would like to thank you for the written comments that were submitted. We will be posting them on our website after this meeting. Anybody who would like to provide verbal comment, please raise your Zoom hand and I'll call you one-on-one. And then I will set a timer for up to 3 minutes for your comments. So feel free to raise your hand. Joe, please say your full name for the record, and we'll get you started.
All right, thanks everybody. I'm Joe Buttafuoco with the Coalition of Oregon Land Trust for the record. Members of the OWEB Acquisition and Restoration Committee, thanks for your time to have me here and comment today. I'm the new executive director for COLT. We have 33 member land trusts, soil and water conservation districts, and other conservation groups working across Oregon. to protect and restore habitat for people and wildlife. Collectively, our members have protected over 318,000 acres of land in our state. Our members benefit from numerous OWEB programs, including land acquisition, OAHP, drinking water source protection grants, and restoration grants. The value of the land acquisition grant program for COLT members and their work across the state cannot be overstated. OWEB is the only major funder of land acquisition dollars in Oregon and the main pathway for land trusts to accomplish major acquisition and restoration projects that provide habitat and species uplift, support connected landscapes, build climate resilience, and provide natural climate solutions and community benefits. The land acquisition program is critical to our members' work, and our community is pleased to see attention to the program through the creation of this committee. At the same time, we're hearing an immense need for additional funding to purchase land in Oregon. A recent survey we did of our members' projects revealed $100 million in projects in the queue to close over the next year or two. Out of that $100 million, our members need to secure an additional $30 million in funding. Because of that, it's imperative OWEB deliver effective and efficient land acquisition programs to rise to this need. The funding need will continue to grow as the collective scale and impact of our members grows. Just want to note, COLT has been working pretty closely with OWEB leadership to understand issues with the programs that our groups have experienced. It's been really great working with OWEB leadership. They've been listening to us and organizing comments into a few buckets that will need action. You'll hear more about that this morning. And we're also working closely with OWEB staff to plan out future conversations. So just want to let you know, we appreciate the attention OWEB staff are giving to this program, and we look forward to the board being involved. We'll be tracking the work of this committee, and we offer ourselves as partners and collaborators in this effort. Together, we can provide benefits to nature and people that are durable and impactful. Thank you for your time and dedication to this issue.
Thank you, Joe. I would like to ask, does any of the committee members have any questions for Joe before we move on? Okay.
I'd just say thanks for sending the written comment as well as verbal. Appreciate the opportunity to read it ahead of time.
Very welcome.
Yes, thank you so much. Anybody else would like to provide public comment, please raise your hands now. Okay, seeing none, I will hand it back to you, Sarah.
Okay, thanks. Let's dive in, guys. I'm going to share, as I said, just a quick overview of the programs that are sort of incorporated under the umbrella of this committee. I will invite staff to correct or add anything that I might have missed here. OWEB grant programs are so numerous and draw from such diverse funding sources with such different names that there are many, many relationships, and it is really hard to figure out how to slice them in a way that makes any sense at all. So we've done our best here to create a committee that makes sense. As I mentioned at the January board meeting, one of staff's goals with this, recommended kind of alteration to the committee is that, or to the committee structure, is that we really wanted to have a board committee home for each grant program. And there's 2.5 or 3 reasons for that. 2 of which you'll see an example of today. So we want to make sure that we have a chance to preview grant program sort of results and funding opportunities, funding recommendations, and bring those here for discussion before they get to the full board, just recognizing that the board has a pretty full plate at each of our quarterly meetings and often can't get much into the weeds. And also they probably generally prefer to hear from their colleagues about more detail related to, funding and program stuff than always only hearing from staff. The second is, as with the land acquisitions modernization project that we're going to talk about for the bulk of the meeting today, it's really helpful. OWEB has this culture of continuous improvement that has just been like miraculous and astonishing to me as I've joined the organization, how driven staff are to make these continuous improvements in programs, anything from kind of the nuts and bolts of how applications work to big picture, sort of how do we offer solicitations, how do we describe and communicate our programs. And it's really nice to have a board home to talk through some of that and be able to get your advice and guidance before we bring something maybe in the form of a rule change or a kind of FYI to the board. It gives us an opportunity to pre-process at a greater level of detail and get your kind of representation and expertise around this stuff. The 2.5th reason, or I guess third reason, is every once in a while weird stuff comes up. And we don't particularly have, I think, an example of that today. But it's really just nice to have a brain trust really focused on a specific set of programs and opportunities to dig in when this kind of stuff comes up. So we're hoping you all can kind of be a trusted partner if something puzzling comes up, either in a solicitation or a program development conversation, just to have you guys as thought partners as we ride along there. So these are the programs that we're covering in this committee related to that. Restoration grants draw from a wide diversity of funding sources. Most of these go through the open solicitation process, maybe all of them. I don't know. Eric and Renee can, not quite all of them. Okay. So lottery funds, Pacific Coast Salmon Recovery Funds through NOAA Fisheries, our salmon license plate dollars, Pacific Corps dollars related to watershed restoration in the Klamath, and BLM dollars, which I think fit in a couple of different project types, but quite a few of them fit under the restoration lens through our cooperative agreement under the Good Neighbor Authority with BLM. We have our land acquisitions program. Renee, most or all lottery funded?
Currently all lottery funded.
Currently all lottery funded. Water acquisitions, you'll also hear more of today. That was originally a legislative allocation. We have our small grants and weed grants programs. Weed grants go through the state weed board, which Stephanie and I had a chance to go and visit and get to know the other day. And we have Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program and drinking water source protection, which you'll also hear more about today. So that's kind of, I could have done it all in acronyms and I resisted the temptation. That's kind of the alphabet soup that falls within this committee's purview. These are the three you'll hear most about today: water acquisitions, drinking water source protection from the funding perspective or the award perspective, and then land acquisitions from the kind of program modernization perspective. I want to pause a second and ask, first, if staff have any corrections, second, if board members have any questions. And also, if board members have one of these that you want to raise your hand and say, my God, I don't know what that is after all these years, or being newer to the board, or boy, we haven't talked about weed grants in a long time. Is there anything in here that we could use some clarification or additional context on in future meetings? While you're thinking, I'm going to also remind us that the board's conversation in January is reflected in the acronym, but not in the list of programs here. This is the Acquisitions, Restoration, and Emerging Issues. So I think I have, in the desire to get through some program content, not really emphasized that in our overview today, but we will make some space for that. Maybe at the end of each meeting, we can identify sort of emerging issues related to this committee's work, but also kind of broader informational items for the board. I know there was one that came up recently with a board member related to emerging contaminants that I think might have an eventual home in this committee. So please do feel free to go ahead and start flagging those, and we'll figure out how to fit those into the meeting structure and work plan for the year. Renee, they look sort of satisfied or dazzled or something like that. Do we want to go ahead and move into, I'll take this down and move into the couple of program-specific conversations, starting with drinking water source protection grants?
Yep, that sounds great. Thanks, Sarah. So other than just underscoring what Audrey mentioned, which is you're getting a preview of the Drinking Water Source Protection Grant Program itself, because our technical review team is meeting on Monday of next week. So we can't talk with you yet about funding recommendations, but just given that it's a new program for the agency, you heard about it extensively in July, but we thought a refresher would be helpful. So with that, I think I'll just turn it over to Audrey. We've got about 5 minutes for presentation and then about 5 minutes for Q&A with the committee members. Thanks.
Thanks, Renee. All right, you all should be seeing my PowerPoint, the lovely design that Linda put together. All right, so diving in, little reminder on the background of the program before we look at the applications we received this year. So this program came to us from the 2023 legislative session. You can see the bills listed on the left and the resulting statute listed at the top. But the gist of it is that this grant program is to provide grants to public water suppliers, which is a new type of grantee for us, to acquire or protect lands in their drinking water source area. So basically, we're trying to help public water suppliers protect their drinking water sources. And it can be for forward-looking purchases or loan repayment. We have $5 million available, $1 million from general funds, which we converted to other funds so that we can keep it long-term and not have it end at the biennium. And then $4 million in lottery revenue bonds. The maximum grant award is $3 million, but you'll see that the highest request was just under 1.5 million, which we really appreciated. We encouraged applicants to look for match elsewhere since there was legislative intent around that, but also so that we could spread out the $5 million and provide more grant awards. Partnerships with holders are allowed, so land trusts and others, but while many applicants are working with land trusts, none are having land trusts hold the land for them. All of the water suppliers will be the long-term owners of the property. And then the focus is on rural communities, lower income communities, and those below 25,000 people. This table shows the two fund sources. So the general funds or other funds, there's $1 million available, 4 million of lottery revenue bonds. General funds are much less restrictive and lottery revenue bonds are much more restrictive. So we had, the second line shows how much was requested from the 8 applications received. And just over 800,000 requested from general funds. And then the rest of it, we show as lottery revenue bond requests, but it can, the lottery bond column, that money can tap into the general funds, the leftover there. The general funds will focus first on loan repayment because of the legislative intent. And then after that, everything else, and particularly including the things that can't be covered by lottery revenue bonds, which are reimbursement, management planning, and indirect costs. And then funding timeline, general funds really have a retrospective aspect to them. They can date back 60 months, and there's no clock for spending them out. Whereas for lottery bonds, there's a 36-month time clock for spending those out. And the bond sale is coincidentally happening on the same day as the board meeting, which is really, really good timing for us. Here's a quick geographic look of where the applications came from. We've got 5 on the coast, 2 in Northern Oregon, and 1 in Eastern Oregon. So we liked seeing this geographic spread of projects. This table shows the applications received. The purpley pink color, probably I would say that that's my daughter's favorite color. She loves pink and purple, so the combination of pink and purple would be perfect for her. Those are the 2 loan repayment projects. And so they'll, like I said earlier, they're kind of competing in their own category because of that legislative intent around loan repayment. And then the other ones are competing in a separate category of non-loan repayment projects. A couple things to call out from this table. All but one project are looking to do fee simple acquisition, so acquiring the land outright. There's one equitable servitude project, which is basically like a conservation easement. And then you can see the sizes of properties, the population served, all vary. And then surface water was really the focus for our applicants. There was one spring project, but mainly surface water. And then something to note here as well, we have $5 million available. There's no way that these funding request amounts will add up to exactly $5 million. And for land acquisition projects, you can't really cut a project in half to finish off that, to get a nice round $5 million number. And we don't want to send the lottery bonds back. So we're going to come to the board next month with a creative way to look at trying to hit that $5 million as close as possible. And so be prepared for that. It's not too wild, but finding a way to make sure that we can help our applicants get to the finish line for their projects and make sure we spend the money that we have. Quick overview of the review timeline that we have been in. The projects, the application deadline was December 12th, and then I did a quick completeness and eligibility review, then passed the applications along to our contractors who looked at real estate and due diligence project readiness. They've finished their reviews. Our technical review team has been in their review process, and we're meeting on Monday. As we mentioned, we've got 12 amazing reviewers. We really have a good spread of interdisciplinary knowledge. Land acquisition, drinking water, water quality, coastal habitats, forestry, management planning, just all across the board, all the things that these projects are getting at. We've got experts to help us look at those. You can see some of the items we had in the review process there that they helped with, virtual site visits, and then the TRT meeting on Monday. We'll get the funding recommendations from that meeting on Monday, and you'll be seeing those at the board meeting in April. And then finally, just a legislative budget and legislative update. In the governor's recommended budget, there's a proposal for staff continuity. So for my position to continue, so I can work with these grantees to help them have successfully completed projects. And then House Bill 3341 is on the table. It's in, I think it's currently with the Ways and Means Committee, and there's a proposal for $5 million of general funds for a future grant round. And then you can see some of the program demand, which I've presented on before, but we're looking at maybe $15 million in requests this biennium if we were to get additional funding, and then at least another 10 million in future biennia. And with that, we can take questions. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Audrey. Board members, any questions? Mark, first up.
Yeah, just for clarification, what's the issue with $5 million, Audrey? Is it that we can't quite spend it, or we spend past it, but we need a bit more, right? What was the issue?
We can't spend past it. Yeah, that's a really good question, Mark. So how the math will add up is, you know, I don't know, obviously I don't know who's going to get funded, but we'll, you know, fund 5 or 6 projects and we'll get to like 4.7 million, let's say. And then there's $300,000 left, but not enough to fund another project. But we don't want to not spend that money. And because the lottery bonds have such a relatively short timeline, we can't extend that past the 3-year timeline. It would be difficult to, and it would be hard to use that in a future grant round. We also don't know if we'll have a future grant round, and 300,000, if that's the leftover amount, isn't enough for a single project. So basically, we're looking at coming to you all with an idea around making that funding available for grantees that may be under budgeted in a key category, especially since they're, as I mentioned, water suppliers are new grantees to OWEB, new to these kinds of grant proposals. And so trying to work with them to help them be as successful as possible. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does. Yeah, that helps a lot. And we can't mix land acquisition dollars to fuel that up?
No, because drinking water does not have any specific focus on habitat quality and fish and wildlife. And that is the really, really important key focus of the land acquisition Measure 76 funds. So there could be co-benefits of drinking water.
Yeah, that's where I was a little confused.
Yeah, there are,
I'm thinking of the Baker watershed, where they're really trying to get the federal government to clean it up. And I assume part of what Baker's doing is purchasing private land in that same area to complement that. and it is going to be a restoration activity, but you're saying that the drinking water program doesn't require that.
Right. So we require a long-term management plan to make
Right.
sure that they know how to that they have a plan for managing the forests that they're acquiring, most are forests, all are forests, so that they can protect drinking water. But it doesn't have any focus on habitat because it's really a focus on drinking water. Those co-benefits completely exist, and many applicants talked about it. But it's just not a requirement, and it may not rise to the habitat quality that we look for in the Measure 76 land acquisition program.
I hear what you're saying. It doesn't make sense to me, but that's
maybe Renee can explain it better. Sarah.
We don't have to go on. Just I am a bit confused about taking care of land for drinking water, but it doesn't have the habitat. So yeah, good.
So Mark, I think the question is great grounding for this first committee meeting, because we will be talking about this a lot. We have now 3 different land transaction programs, each with different statutory underpinnings and slightly different intents. And so we will absolutely be digging in on some of this to understand why some of those lanes exist and talking through I think valid question that you have about kind of that interplay between source water protection and habitat. But at present, those are standalone programs that have different expectations and statute.
And I think one other quick thing, Mark, is just that, for example, there is a project where they're protecting, they're going to protect the area around a stream, but the stream is small and doesn't have some audits in it. And so, it's just not the same kind of focus areas. But at the board meeting, we'll have more descriptions, more in-depth descriptions of the application, so you can see a bit more about what the purposes of those grants are.
Sure, thanks.
Yeah.
Dan.
Thanks, Audrey. Just in the same realm of ensuring or trying to maximize use of the funds, I'm curious, and this is my ignorance here, these acquisitions are obviously complex, and with the 36-month time frame and knowing that sometimes stuff falls apart, I didn't know if we have the flexibility to have a contingency plan. In other words, here are the projects that we're funding, but let's say 12 months in, one of those goes south. Is there something else that we could slide in behind that?
That's a really good question, Dan. I had the same thought, and Renee and I talked a lot about that, about if it would work. And I think we went away from that option because 12 months down the road, that potential next ranked application might not be as ready as it was 12 months prior. And there might be other ones out there. And so in that case, if we end up with multiple canceled grants and an extra $1 million or $2 million, I think a better route might be to open another grant cycle and look for super ready projects, ones that can close really quickly.
Russ, I saw your hand up, and then I think we probably better switch topics unless
I'm
there's
fine.
another pressing question. Really?
I'm good. Yep.
We got time for you.
No, it's okay.
I wasn't rushing. Okay. Audrey, thanks so much. I do want to add, given the timing of the bond sale, I thought my idea was to just auction them off at the board meeting, but I to the highest bidder, but apparently that's not how bonds work. Renee, did you want to add something else?
Yeah, I just want to say thanks again to Dan Brown for serving on the RAC when we were standing up the program. And Audrey has done an immense lift on this. Learning the lottery revenue bond world with Miriam Scher has been quite a feat. So thank you to Audrey. So far, things are going swimmingly. So we'll look forward to talking with all of you about the funding recommendations in April.
Thanks, Audrey. Water acquisitions, right?
Yep. I think, Brian, just take it away.
Acquiring all kinds of things.
All right, everybody. I wanted let's get this going. All right, can everybody see my screen?
We can. And can you say your name for the record again, Brian, too,
Yeah,
just in case?
Brian Walcott, Water Acquisition and Capacity Grant Coordinator. And today I wanted to give you all a little bit to chew on related to water acquisition grants. First, in this limited amount of time, I'll give a brief refresher about the water acquisition program, and then a little overview of the review process, and then some information about the two proposals that'll be before the board in April. And I did want to state that the water acquisition grant program is one of the original grant programs when OWEB formed. And in 2022, there were additional funds dedicated to the program through a legislative appropriation of $10 million. There's currently about $8 million available to fund grants moving forward. The Water Acquisition Grant Program has a purpose of increasing in-stream flow for habitat species and water quality benefits through the transfer of water rights to in-stream uses. Transaction mechanisms include in-stream leases, permanent in-stream transfers, and other water use agreements. Eligible projects by rule must acquire interest in legal water rights from willing sellers that will result in legally or contractually protected in-stream flows to address identified conservation needs of habitats and species as identified by Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and in consideration of needs identified by federal and tribal fish and wildlife agencies. Or the project can improve water quality and water quality limited streams identified by Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. And also, if an application is within an irrigation district, then that applicant needs to notify the irrigation district where the project is within that irrigation district's boundary. The review process starts when applications come in through a grant cycle. There's a quick eligibility and completeness check on those, and those are sent out to the technical review team, which is comprised of members from federal, state, and tribal agencies, individuals that have background and experience with water right transactions, with fish biology, with water quality. And then we also have some private contractors that assist with the water evaluation review and organizational capacity review. The technical review team evaluates the proposals in relation to 15 water acquisition evaluation criteria, and they deliberate strengths and concerns about projects and then come up with a recommendation as to whether the project should be funded, not funded, or funded with conditions. And that's put into an evaluation and staff report for the board. And here, I won't read through all these, we don't have time, but the evaluation criteria center around 5 primary categories: the characteristics of the water rights involved with the project, the ecological outcomes if the project is implemented, the watershed context, where the project is being proposed, and the organizational capacity, the ability of the applicant to implement the project and ensure that the investment is sound and does what it intends. And then also the cost effectiveness of the project in relation to the value of the water, and also the value of the project and the environmental benefits that would come from it. The first of the 2 projects that are going to be coming before the board in April that is Illinois River. This is a tributary of the Rogue River in Southwest Oregon. And this is a project brought forward by Trout Unlimited. And this is an irrigation efficiency project where the applicant's looking for funds to implement irrigation efficiency upgrade that will result in saved water, and all that saved water will remain in the Illinois River. And it doesn't provide a lot of water, but it is a senior water right. And this is a reach of the Illinois River that does experience lower stream flows and higher temperatures in the summertime during irrigation season. And this is the beginning of a pilot program to address irrigation efficiency as identified in state and federal fishery recovery plans as a way to improve stream flows and temperatures for endangered salmon, and also to improve conditions for steelhead, lamprey, and improve temperatures. This project is being cost shared by Oregon Water Resources Department through their grants and loans program, and also by the property owner, who is also investing time and money into the project. The second proposal that'll be coming before the board is the Clark Creek Streamflow Restoration Palo In-Stream Lease Project. Trout Unlimited is the applicant for this project. This is located in Northeast Oregon. It's on Clark Creek, a tributary of the Grand Ronde River to the northeast of La Grande. And this project is asking for funding for a 5-year in-stream lease. And this project would deliver 1.63 cubic feet per second of protected water in stream at the lower end of Clark Creek, and benefit a couple miles of stream, where it would be combined with, if you all remember from last year, this was a location where the OWEB board approved a permanent transfer on a water right on a property immediately upstream from this location. The technical review team appreciated that this project could have a cumulative benefit and for Clark Creek to improve conditions for steelhead, ESA listed steelhead. But there's also a challenge with the evidence provided as to whether this water right had been used in recent years. And so those are the two projects that'll be coming before the board. There'll be more detail about the program and about these projects when that's presented. But I just wanted to see if you all had any questions about the program or about these proposals.
Board members, any questions? Mark Webb. Unmute, Mark, please. Thanks.
Brian, on the Illinois River project, are those senior water rights upstream or downstream from the majority of other, say, junior water right users?
No, great question, Mark. Yeah, those are senior. They're 1887 water rights and would be senior. And they have 2 points of diversion. One is on an upstream tributary, East Fork of the Illinois River, and they also have a diversion near the actual farm. And the water master has indicated that that water would be protectable from that upper point of diversion about 6 miles downstream through the Illinois River until it goes through a gap beyond any irrigated lands and would be in stream down to where the Illinois runs into the Rogue River.
Oh, okay. And then maybe a request. I don't know if this is possible, but I think on the Clarks Creek one, you said 1.63 cubic feet. I'm just wondering if at the next OWEB board meeting, there could be a video for how much water that actually is that makes a difference.
Brian, you and Linda put in some figure a while back, didn't you? Do you still
Yeah. Linda actually helped put together a diagram, a little video clip to try to quantify what a cubic feet per second looks like. And just for just for perspective, I think about I don't know, it's really difficult when you start thinking about gallons per minute and cubic feet per second. But the Illinois River, where that project occurs, even though it's only providing 0.14 of a cubic feet per second, flows in that stretch of the river in a low flow year get as low as 30 cubic feet per second. So it's not a big increase, but it's some increase of cooler water that remains in stream and would flow through that area and help with flows and temperatures in a place where flow and temperature impacts are affecting the fish in that reach.
That's a great tip, Mark. We'll bring that graphic back to the full board meeting. And if somebody needs a volunteer to stay along the Illinois River for a while and take some video of different flow levels, I'm happy to volunteer for that mission. Bruce?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Having voted on a number of these projects through the years, I've established a priority, which could very likely be just a bias. And do we have any criteria which prioritizes the type of acquisition, whether it's permanent, a purchase, whether it's temporary, short? The timeline on these has always been, it's always been important to me, but I don't know if it's important in the criteria that we use evaluation.
A great question, Bruce. Yes, we do have a criteria in the cost-effective category that looks at the term of the project, whether it is a limited in-stream lease for a limited amount of time versus a permanent in-stream transfer, or a project like the Illinois River one that I just showed, where it's an irrigation efficiency project with a permanent in-stream transfer of the water savings. So part of that original water right stays on the farm. The other portion of the original water right keeps that date but remains in stream and is protectable. So yeah, that the review team definitely factors in the term of a project as they're making a decision on whether to recommend a project.
I would just add briefly, all that said, there is space in this program for different instrument and transaction types to be utilized. And I think over multiple rules advisory committee processes, the concept of gateways has been an important one. So kind of using the analogy of the small grant program as a gateway for a landowner to explore what might be possible, but in kind of lower risk space. Before they jump right in with a large restoration project, just as an example. So without a doubt, that is accounted for, and we try to provide some flexibility for that exploration and test driving.
Those are some good questions, guys. Thank you.
And just to follow up on that, the permanent transfer that was funded last year by OWEB, that initially started out as a 5-year lease. And the landowner was able to evaluate that, come up with a plan for their property into the future, and then decided to move forward with a permanent transfer of what had been an in-stream lease.
Cool. Dan?
I'm just curious, Brian, and I'm expecting that it's probably related to what Bruce was talking about the different kinds of transfers, but the sort of dollar per cubic foot per second varies so widely, it seems like, for some of these. Is that kind of related to whether it's like a permanent or temporary or?
Absolutely. Yeah, and with the water valuations that are required with these, that is something that's looked at. Because not only for the in-stream water market, but the out-of-stream water market, if somebody is leasing a water right for growing a crop, they're certainly going to pay less if they're leasing that from a neighbor for several years versus a permanent acquisition of that water to bring that over to their farm. And so that helps when that type of water market is already occurring in a basin. That helps to inform the price of short-term transfer of water versus and also what might be a reasonable cost of water for a permanent transfer.
Brian,
That
every
was
time
super
I
helpful. Of
hear you talk
course.
about, oh, sorry, go ahead, Dan.
I was just saying, of course, and it's super helpful. I wasn't even kind of thinking of it in those terms. So thank you.
Any other questions for Brian? Brian, I was going to say, every time I hear you talk about water acquisitions, I understand it a lot better while I'm listening, and then my baseline actual retained level of knowledge comes up a little bit too. So I think I might want to go back and watch. I think you guys did a water acquisitions 101 at my first board meeting.
Yeah,
if I watch
done
that another
two.
10 times, I'll be there.
Yeah, we did a water acquisitions part 1 and then a water acquisition 101 part 2 to help explain some of these concepts.
I'm working my way up. It does not come as naturally to me as land acquisitions does, but I guess years of exposure. Gang, thanks so much, Brian. This is great, and look forward to seeing the conversation at the full board meeting. Well, we did drinking water source protection, we did water acquisitions. Are we ready for an even deeper dive into land acquisitions now? And land transactions. Renee, you want to steer your slides? Or you want me to bring
Yeah,
them up?
I
Okay.
will. And just before we jump to that, we are very, very fortunate to have someone with Brian's deep expertise on water acquisitions. I share Sarah's thoughts. He blows me away every time we're talking about these issues. So yeah, we're very fortunate. All right, so jumping to land acquisitions. Let me make sure this is presenting. Okay, so Sarah, are you seeing the slideshow?
Yep, you've got it up.
Okay, and let's see here. Let me see if it switches to presenter mode.
Yeah, I think it'll be a little easier to see if it does for sure.
There we go. Is that
Got
looking
it.
better? Okay.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. So we have about a dozen slides to walk through. I think about halfway through, we'll have a slide that invites clarifying questions on kind of the first set. So I think if we could hold to maybe going through the first several slides, having a check-in with the committee members then, and then opening it up for broader discussion, that'd be helpful. So Sarah has referenced, sorry, for the record, Renee Davis, Acquisitions and Special Programs Manager. So we're going to really begin the orientation today on the program modernization for the land acquisition grant program. Going back to Mark Webb's comments or questions, this is about the Measure 76 focus land acquisitions. We are not talking here about OHP or drinking water source protection. Nonetheless, we may have some learnings to share with those programs. So in terms of why, in addition to, as Sarah mentioned, the long history that OWEB has of continuous improvement of our granting processes, the letter late summer, early fall from the governor to Sarah as part of her expectations letter to Sarah and other new executive directors did include a specific reference about the land acquisition funding. So I'm not going to read this to you, but just hitting the high points in terms of this. The land acquisition program is an incredibly important component of OWEB's work, was part of the constitutional and statutory direction to the agency. There are some concerns from the governor's office perspective about the requirements of the program, and if those have gotten too cumbersome since the inception of OWEB starting to offer the land acquisition grant program. So the governor directed the agency to do a thorough review of the land acquisition program and to really look at some of the requirements, both front end and back end, to determine what is critically important to meet the expectation for the program from a constitutional and statutory perspective, but potentially with some streamlining opportunities. So that is the mandate and charge from the governor. Okay, so in terms of the process to date, and Joe mentioned this in his public comment, the letter and the verbal public comment. So we really appreciate Colt partnering with us to help to convene 2 listening sessions thus far. Colt also has done some separate surveying of their members and partner organizations to help us get a handle on what are some of those issues or challenges you're bumping into, where might there be opportunities to address some of those. So we've gone through a process collaboratively with Colt and did some cross-checking back with Colt members about creating some buckets, as we're calling them, of issues. It's a very sophisticated term we came up with, and we'll walk through that. But just to start to put our arms around it in a way that is, I think, more manageable and kind of tackleable. We've also put together a very rough draft work plan and timeline, so you might want to buckle your seatbelts for when we talk about that. Several slides from now, we have a lift before us in terms of some of the committee work and ultimately work with the board. I do want to flag that it's been a couple years ago, I think, maybe even more than that. Time has become fluid since COVID. Since Allie Miller did the tribal assessment a few years back, initially, she was a PSU student, and then some subsequent work that several staff have really tried to dive in and understand what are some of those issues that tribal nations as sovereigns are facing in terms of engaging with the land acquisition program. So acknowledging that is happening, we have a parallel process because we want to be very respectful of the sovereignty issues. And Sarah and I are happy to update about that with the committee also. So in terms of the buckets, we've put them into 3 buckets of philosophical, cultural, and process. And so philosophical, you might think of as kind of foundational issues too. So to dig in on some of this, so this philosophical foundational bucket, there are 3 kind of primary pieces to that. So one, I would describe as the question of, is protection only acceptable for land acquisitions, or is there an expectation that if something comes in that is more moderate or modest kind of habitat condition, is there an expectation of proactive restoration? And some of this really goes back to the significant habitat language that is in the Constitution and then subsequently perpetuated through statute. So that has definitely presented us kind of area of concern and some sticking points, I would say, around those restoration expectations relative to protection alone. The second issue, and Sarah, please jump in at any point here for clarification as needed, is really around how do you balance those expectations around Measure 76 land acquisitions, really focusing on habitat benefits to native fish and wildlife species. How do you balance that with the potential for interest in or expectations around other uses? And those could be recreational uses, cultural uses, working lands uses. And what is there a line? Is there a threshold? Is there some additional clarity that could be provided about the impact, how much impact is acceptable relative to Measure 76? And then the third item within this bucket is the question around, we currently as an agency utilize conservation easements that we hold on top of fee title investments or third-party right of enforcement on conservation easement investments to secure that long-term protection. Is there the potential for some other set of instruments to still meet that title restriction statute that we have, but maybe provide some more flexibility? So those, I would say, are kind of the big foundational issues in this philosophical bucket. We have a cultural bucket that it's varied in terms of some of the feedback we've heard. So I will touch on a few of these. So customer service experience. So as an example, are there kind of different approaches that we've taken around customer service across our programs, land acquisition relative to restoration, relative to other programs? And can we have some consistency there in terms of more clarity, more collaboration? Are some of the questions and concerns we've heard. Some questions around risk tolerance and risk management. And if I think back to my first board meeting when Kelly Beamer was still the COLT executive director, it was the first board meeting I was at that since we created the new program within the agency. I remember Kelly talking about through time, land acquisitions have really grown and increased in terms of sophistication and capacity. They are there to help protect and defend the interests of these investments. And so I think this question is important for the committee and subsequently the board to sort through. What is our risk tolerance and how do we manage and distribute risk? Because to date, we have used certain tools like a conservation easement to make sure that that investment is secured. And so I think there is interest in a conversation about what is the agency's risk tolerance and how might risk management be handled. And we've heard some about also kind of connections or differences maybe between acquisitions and restoration investments and how we handle risk tolerance on that. Definitely have heard some feedback around interest in making sure the board is well grounded in intent around land acquisitions, what they offer, kind of more of the nuts and bolts of how they work. And also, it's termed here budget allocations, but the amount of investment that the board is flagging in the biennial spending plans for land acquisition. And then wanted to flag, we have heard about tribal participation, and potential barriers to that participation or access in the program, but wanted to flag that is a process that we are continuing relative to that sovereignty. And then the final bucket is around process. I've thrown some examples up here. So just an interest in more transparency, and whether that be in the project soundness review process or another piece of the review process pre-award, or greater understanding about can we have more transparency into some of the whys during the due diligence phase once a project is awarded and we have that 18-month to close period. Is there space for some process refinement or changes to make the program more able to dovetail with other funding sources? And then I would say a set of just kind of interests and requests around, is there a potential for streamlining grant making, level of detail in management plans or processes for changes, and then references to potential additional streamlining of the easement template, which we've done some through time, but still some interest there. So those are the 3 buckets. I'm going to stop and see if folks have clarifying questions, but try to keep us from diving too far in, because we now need to talk about next steps with a work plan. But any clarifying questions? Bruce, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. This looks very comprehensive. Are we certain that we're addressing the exact issues that gave rise to the governor's mandate?
I would say yes, and I would ask our executive director to speak to that.
I think so, Bruce, and we're continuing this conversation with the governor's natural resource as well to kind of double check and make sure. I think, and we'll dig into this a little bit more when Renee talks about work plan, but that first bucket of philosophical or foundational issues translates into the other levels. And so it's like kind of an upstream, downstream thing. Having just said I don't really understand water, where it's like these are the big foundational things that caused us to make program design decisions. And in past sort of modernization or continuous improvement efforts, we've mostly focused on the downstream to midstream part, where it's like, okay, this is something that's driving folks nuts about the process, and let's try and tweak that. And the feedback we've gotten is that sometimes we actually end up making the process more complex when we do that. And so that is a little bit of background to the conversation that I have been actually having with Jeff Huntington at the governor's office, which is like, we think we need to go further upstream this time. We think we really need to start, especially with this board committee, and I'm hoping to get some participation from Jeff potentially, or a designee that he might send, to really dive into those foundational issues and not just kind of fix stuff around the edges, but really get to the upstream causes. And I know that that is consistent with the mandate. That's consistent with how I talked through it with Jeff through a number of conversations. And I'm hoping to get enough of his attention to make sure that we stay on course and really prioritize side by side the intent of the governor's letter and the governor's office, and also that came from what they were hearing from land trusts and other grantee partners. And so there's more answer than you probably looked for.
Mark?
Yeah, I really appreciate the way that was laid out, Renee, and whoever else helped you. I was tickled to death to see philosophical. I think it's the first time I've seen that word, and it's a discipline dear to my heart in an agency discussion that didn't confuse it with psychology. But I do think those bullet points are really important, particularly the first one, I think is pretty key. So that's just a comment, but my question is, I appreciate the wisdom of working with Colt and the collaborative sort of process. But if somebody were to come up to me and ask me how I think we should go about it, I would have said, I would certainly ask staff what they think would help simplify this and streamline it. And so I don't need an answer now, but my question would be whether the buckets and the Colt sort of recommendations align with what staff thinks. And I would really like to know what staff thinks would make a difference, because that's what I would trust, given how much y'all do this.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mark. And you'll see when we hit on the draft work plan components, there absolutely will be work by an internal work group will connect up with an external work group, because some of this is really that interplay, and you'll see it soon, between process really is driven at times by some of those foundational pieces. And we need to sort through, from a board perspective, what are your thoughts, risk tolerances, directions to staff versus, you know, you're not always in the nuts and bolts of developing application questions. We have to figure out if there's a streamlining set of work that we can do, but how that connects up to topics, those big topics about which we need some direct input from the board.
Thanks.
Yeah, Russ, go ahead.
Again, I agree that the presentation was very helpful to have the 3 buckets. I think we could work through those very effectively, but I'm hoping that there'll be a time for us to really get an understanding and clarity about the words in the Constitution and the authors of the Constitution, constitutional amendments that we're working with in 76 and getting to the core of it. Unfortunately, one of the authors of the document has passed in 2012, but 2 of them are live and kicking, and I think that would be helpful to hear from at least the 2 of them as to the roots here. And as it relates to the words in the Constitution, I remember very clearly the conversation and debate about the tools to be used for land acquisition. And it said, but not limited to easement and fee acquisitions. And there is a breadth of other tools, but it seems like there's a comfort level in the utilization of fee and easement. And other places, other institutions use other tools. And I'd be curious to understand why there's a movement towards, and it seems like a lock into those tools.
Yep, thanks for that, Russ. Absolutely on our radar in terms of both some of that core constitutional intent around Measure 66, then 76, and then sorting through some of the whys behind use to date of easements relative to Oregon law and exploration of what are some of those other tools and how might they be considered, being mindful of that title restriction statute that currently stands within our statutory bucket. Dan, go ahead.
So just curious about clarification on risk tolerance. Is the risk we're talking about limited to the risk of losing restoration value, or is there multiple risks that we need to be focusing on in this committee?
Well, Sarah's coming off mute quick, so I'll ask her to respond.
I'll get started, but Renee, I think we might have like parallel answers to that question and fit our puzzle pieces together. I think, Dan, there are a number of different kinds. One is, yeah, how do we make sure that if we're making a permanent investment, a long-term, large-scale investment in land protection, that persists, that it's robust to legal challenge, that it's robust to uses that conflict with the habitat and water quality values that were constitutionally mandated to spend these dollars on. I think there is another risk that is kind of worth flagging and reminding folks of, and Russ, I think, will remember this well, and other Measure 66 and 76 alums, that part of the point of sort of some of the changed language that was in ballot measure 76 compared to 66 was driven by a concern about lottery funds that were designated for the natural resources portion being used to backfill other natural resource sort of normal state agency costs. And so I think sometimes we focus on the first of those risks, like how do we actually make sure the land's protected and stay protected? But one of the other things that I think has led to a relatively conservative interpretation by OWEB staff of constitutional and statutory language over time is just to be a desire to be consistent with that constitutional intent that these dollars are additional to base natural resources funding, and they're going into acquisitions, restoration, and other kinds of projects that feed into those, and they're not getting, sidelined and diverted to other kinds of projects just because, so some of the sideboards that you see, I think, in our program are meant to address that risk. And maybe I think if the land trust looks at that, might say, why do you have to hem me in so much? I have a conservation mission. Why don't you trust me? Why do we need to have all of this paperwork and boxes checked to be able to avoid the first kind of risk? And so I think there are a couple of different kinds of risk at play. And I think sometimes a broader look at that can really help us understand what the original intent of some of these more restrictive sideboards or language might be. And I guess I would add too, in terms of the potential for project failure, let's say that well, actually, let me stop there and pass it to Renee. Renee, did I take us off
No,
message
no,
there at all? Do you want to add?
No, I would just say that, Dan, I do think a lot of it is focused more on how the risk tolerance and risk threshold around securing these investments through time, because they are permanent investments and a lot can change. I mean, we heard in October about some restoration investment to help address some challenges that have come up on a past land acquisition. So things change over the decades. And so I think just having, again, some space to kind of sort through what is our risk tolerance, understanding the permanent nature. And then, I appreciate what Sarah commented on, because I think just that scales that we're considering in terms of that, aligning the investment with what was intended with the Constitution, including the writ large investment. Yeah. So maybe we go to Russ and then I finish the slide deck because I did not follow my own instructions about letting us.
Yeah, we're going to tell you guys about your workload for the next couple months. We better get to that.
Hope you're muted, Russ.
One final comment on this section here. When we think about risk tolerance and thresholds, if you think about habitat restoration investments versus land acquisition investments, over the years, the argument has been we're spending significantly more money on land acquisition versus restoration. But in fact, if you look at many of the restorations we're doing now, the dollars being invested are in fact sometimes exceeding what a traditional land acquisition would be. But the degree of protections that the state is requiring for a restoration project are not consistent with those that we require for the land acquisitions. And I think that we need to square that and really understand that fundamentally as we move forward. Perhaps that's a philosophical, but I think it is a process and a cultural issue as well.
Yep, thanks, Russ.
Yeah, sorry, Renee, I can't resist. Russ, I think that's going to come up again and again in our conversations, and I think it really emphasizes the importance, and I think Bruce Buckmaster has talked about this some in sort of a risk management lens of like looking at our full portfolio of programs when we think about risk to our conservation mission and like how do we balance that? Some projects will always fail. And some of them are large and some of them are small and some of them will fail because of legal issues and some of them will fail because of stuff like wildfires. And where we really, I think, will most need you guys' thought partnership and sort of ambassadorship and bringing this back to the full board is when we bring something like we did with a couple of projects last time back to the board that's about acquisitions, that's about easements, the board kind of shifts into oversight mode, and appropriately so. I mean, that's part of your job, is to make sure that we're not taking on unreasonable risk on behalf of the agency and our funding and our mission. But the cumulative impact of those comments sometimes is for the staff to perceive, and maybe even partners to perceive, the board as being very risk averse. Of like, you guys are checking to make sure that we've done our due diligence, and that we don't know how to balance those conversations. And so that's something where I think philosophically it would be great to have your, as I said, thought partnership and ambassadorship back to the full board of like, how do we talk about easements and acquisitions and other sort of transaction tools with the board in a way that balances that appropriate oversight role with kind of a more portfolio view to say, like, we don't have to zero out risk. But when we just bring you something and you look for sources of risk, it looks like you're more risk averse than you probably are. And how do we interpret that as a staff and think about how we apply that to our own processes? I'll stop now, Renee. I'm sorry.
No, thanks, Sarah. It's super helpful. And I think part of what Sarah's describing is where we don't want to come out the other side of this process is kind of the muddle in the middle, where we are trying to protect still against a lot of risk, but reduce burden, streamline, and have this inability, this kind of untenable situation. So I think just having some open conversations about that is going to be very important, so staff can have a program that is implementable out the other side of this. Okay, so I'll try to move through these pretty quickly. So there clearly are some interdependencies between the buckets. Linda did not have the ability to beautify this slide, so you can tell that. So it is really hard to use Sarah's point of which stick do you pick up? Which end of the stick do you even pick up? So philosophical, cultural process, there's a lot of interconnections there. In addition, even within buckets, do you talk about the instrument used in the form of conservation easement separately from the restoration requirement or expectation around the significant habitat language in the Constitution? What about those other uses and those thresholds? So our message is, this is a complicated conversation. So given all of that, we have put together a very rough proposed work plan. Wanted to begin orienting you to that today, trying to figure out where do we start. Our thinking is we do start with that philosophical bucket. We want to make sure there is some education around the program history, and that's not to say you all know nothing. You have an immense amount of collective understanding of land acquisitions, but just getting to that common grounding of what prompted creation of the program, how the program has evolved through time, and some of the experiences that we have had from staff perspective, agency perspective, local partners perspective, and how that's kind of playing out now in current. So making sure we have some engagement with Governor's Natural Resources Office, some program history, could be some of the Measure 66, 76 authors, certainly interested partners such as land trusts, tribes, and other interested parties. Through time, we've heard some feedback about land acquisitions as an example. So don't want to lose some of that concern in terms of some of the comments around protection or taking land out of production as an example. We did want to flag there will need to be Department of Justice involvement here and there. I think the session last July was super helpful when Contact Council came and sat with you all, and we had the Land Acquisitions 101. So definitely recognizing we'll want to have that space too for the committee. So again, focusing on the philosophical bucket, we may need to do some prioritization. Even within that, do we start with an easement conversation, restoration requirement conversation, but then begin to fold in that cultural bucket, especially around risk tolerance, because pretty quickly some of these philosophical questions will turn into, and then what is the comfort level of the board, the agency, with different risk paths, if you will. So we'll be reporting out from the committee to the full board periodically. Ultimately, we'll want to elevate for decision to the full board some of the recommendations that you all come up with around philosophical and cultural topics within the board's grant making purview. So our thinking is, yes, we will have the quarterly meetings that Nicole already has on your calendar. At times, though, those may need to be longer than an hour and a half because these are big, complex issues. Sarah and I have also talked about we will need to keep this train moving and hopefully can utilize some monthly coordination with the committee co-chairs to make sure we're planning the meetings in a thoughtful and effective fashion to really try to maximize that time with this committee. And the target, and I'm going to knock wood right now, is that we would go to the board in January of 2026 after being able to have 4 committee conversations. That is our target timeline to present recommendations to the full board for deliberation. So that will be a lift, without a doubt. And then there will be some parallel work. One, as I mentioned a few times, the tribal sovereignty considerations. Already have some work underway in terms of staff analysis and some research by Department of Justice to better understand what some of the options are relative to tribal sovereigns, and engagement with the program, and some of the concerns, as an example, we've heard around the instruments that we use. We are hearing from the land trust community, we need you also to make sure that there's a 2025 grant cycle opportunity, given some of the needs out there on the ground. We are open to exploring some kind of minor manageable streamlining of the existing process, but not in a way that gets out in front of this committee's work, and also not in a way that is kind of crazy making, because we're trying to do too many things at once. But we recognize we need to offer a 2025 solicitation. And then ultimately, once we have the discussion with the board, it could be that you all as board members with your colleagues decide to initiate rulemaking. If there are things that we decide are in rule that need to be addressed, certainly we'll need to update the program processes and materials. We'll do that with internal staff group input as needed from external partners. And there may be, I just added this last bullet, the land acquisition principles and priorities document is from 2004. It could be that you all suggest we'd like a crosswalk with the state wildlife action plan, the conservation strategy, to just have some kind of refreshed information. So that gives you a sense of the draft work plan. I don't know where we are with time. We've got about 9 minutes, it looks like, Sarah. So we'd love to have input, feedback, if there are specific, we've already gotten some ideas, examples of background history that is really important to this committee as we dig in. So I think I'll stop sharing so we can all see one another, unless someone wants to revisit something on a slide. And Sarah, anything to add before we close?
No, why don't you go ahead and take it down, Renee, so we can all see each other. I would add to that questions list, who else do you need to hear from? I appreciated Russ flagged an interest in hearing from some of the original authors of Measure 76 and the constitutional and the ballot measure language. And we've been in touch a little bit, and I think that's very possible. We've been asking for some kind of early guidance and pre-interpretation from those folks too. Who else would you like to hear from? What else would you like to learn? Questions or concerns? Russ?
In terms of continual input, having access to the expertise in Colt in this process, working along with us, will be very helpful. I mean, they live and breathe these issues, and I want to make sure that we are getting tribal input along the way as well. Very, very, very critical as we get to a close on this this issue. But I think being pressed by a 2026 January deadline is urgency here, and I appreciate us all being willing to dig in and work together. But I would like to have Colt or a subset of Colt working with us side by side if we could.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate the point about tribal engagement, certainly, Russ, as well. Joe and I had a chance to talk a little bit from Colt earlier this week and talked about sort of, hey, can we get a couple of land trust folks to really focus on this conversation and kind of serve as ambassadors to the full group of land trust and Colt that are interested, and also maybe a couple of folks to focus on the low-hanging fruit kind of minor edits that Renee described for the 2025 cycle. So Joe knows that ask is coming, and he can kind of check in with his members and see where folks are. Renee flagged too, a reminder that, acquisitions have sometimes been controversial land acquisitions have sometimes been controversial throughout the life of OWEB. And so it might be worth thinking about, and Renee and I talked about this a little bit already this week, how can we hear from the landowner community? How can we hear from Mark, the county commissioners and judges, folks in the, no? Okay, Mark's our ambassador. Folks in the broader community to sort of raise understanding and seek feedback on how we can do this work in a way that works well for a diversity of community members, and land trusts have sort of raised the flag and really asked for these program changes. And we want to be sort of respectful and attentive to that. But there are a lot of folks who live in communities with these projects that probably have things to say about them and how we run them as well. So we might ask some advice on how best to connect with other voices as we work through the process here.
So I was teasing in a bit. It will be challenging. You might reach out to AOC, Association of Oregon Counties,
That's a great idea, Mark.
rather than just individual commissioners, and get a sense. I mean, I could tell you right off the primary concerns. I don't know that they're relevant, to the actually legislation or the measure itself, but I'd reach out to AOC and tell them what you're doing, and it'd be nice to have some participation, and they'll have a land resources person, I think.
That's a great idea. Thanks, Mark. Other questions or comments before we wrap up?
The only one more thing for me, and I think it'll come up, Renee sort of alluded to it, but I do think that first bullet point under philosophical issues, is for me going to be really key about, I'll just put it this way, when more recent, I haven't been on here long, but when I see what the applications are for conservation easements or land acquisition, typically arguments are given that these are significant habitats. In my experience, they're no more significant than the neighbors. I mean, they're mostly degraded as a result of a lot of kind of management activities. And that's just a fact we live with, but I would like to better understand how to evaluate those in terms of long-term ecological outputs or desired outcomes that we're going to do, and how you measure that. And at least for everything east of the Cascades, with rare exception, it's going to be the rare piece of ground that's not going to require additional restoration dollars to be improved. And so this is an ongoing commitment. It's not like purchased and done.
Yeah.
And I would like to hear from the land trust outfits, how they're envisioning that, or is this, I'm not opposed to it, but is this a long-term commitment on the state's part to making sure that you as a landowner have the opportunity to have the funds to manage it? So I think that's key in terms of risk tolerance and what we're managing long-term as a portfolio perspective.
Yeah, I agree, Mark. That was my favorite topic of those three too. And I really wanted to start with it, to tell you the truth. We did a survey through Colt, and there was a much stronger interest in starting with the conservation easements topic first.
Yeah.
And I think there's some logic to that too, because what instrument you're using might change your view on the sort of future conditions and restoration expectations. So I've been trying to talk myself into that, but I share your interest in the first topic, and I want to keep thinking about it. And I think we'll, as Renee's figure showed, we'll talk about each of those when we talk about each of those. I don't think we'll be able to sort of isolate those. So we'll try to come up with a logical sequence. But I think that is an example where we have hung a lot of process and program design weight on a very small amount of constitutional language, and just a word or two that through interpretation over time, we've kind of steered down a specific path a really long ways. And if we decide that, if the board's decision and guidance from the governor's office is that it makes sense to reinterpret some of that language and to shift our view on that, it'll be some really big changes potentially to the program. So it's a rich vein of philosophical discussion for sure. I'm glad we have a philosopher with us. Kelly?
Thanks, Sarah. I really appreciated the overview. Just this was really great for setting the stage. So thank you. I know the staff put a lot of time into this. As far as the tribal piece, I know we have a separate process going on with that, but it's parallel and they're also very deeply connected moving forward. So I would just hope that at future meetings, we can kind of get an update for this committee about how that process is going and anything that we're hearing so we can incorporate that information. I know, I mean, I might have an inside scoop on it, you know, because being the tribal co-chair and working with Ken and being very integrated with all of that. But I want to make sure that the rest of the committee has a good idea of what's going on with that as well. So that's my only suggestion moving forward.
Yeah, that's a really good idea, Kelly. We want to keep those processes as connected as possible. And of course, invite tribal partners to both conversations, not just to the separate tribally focused one, and make sure we're offering engagement there. Friends, by my clock, it's 9:29 or 10:29, so I don't think we better dive into charter or co-chairs. We will send out, Nicole and I have been working on a draft charter that, as Lindsay McClary, I think, suggested in our last board meeting, we felt like we could actually use a common charter for all three committees and just a little bit of individual language on specific committee roles related to programs. We'll be sharing that with you in draft form before the next board meeting. If you're interested in co-chairing this committee, keep in mind how much fun it is. And also keep in mind that the lift might be a little heavier than some of the other committees. You really pretty much just have to learn the agenda early and show up for meetings and chair them at the other committees. This one, at least for this year, we're going to ask for a monthly meeting of, let's say, an hour or so with co-chairs. And then, so keep that in mind. Shoot Nicole Bettinardi and I an email if you're interested. If we don't hear from you in a week, we will talk to you about your interest that we may sort of inflict on folks, and see if we can encourage a couple of folks to volunteer that way. And then we'll have co-chairs in place ready to vote at the beginning of the next meeting, and then just organize in advance and ask them to co-chair the next meeting so you guys don't have to listen to me so much. Finally, Renee also mentioned the next meeting, which will be in June, we will probably look to extend. So keep an eye out for Nicole's email, which I don't think I have told Nicole about yet, seeking to extend that meeting and possibly move it to make room for a longer couple of hours to be able to do a deep dive on some of our land acquisition 101 issues and maybe a connection with DOJ there. Anything else for the good of the order? They didn't give me a gavel, but I will adjourn us if you guys are ready. Thank you so much, board, staff, public. Really great to see the interest and engagement in this committee. Thanks for your time, and we'll see you at the upcoming board meeting.